Thank you for joining our latest Dysgraphia Life webinar. If you have not been to our website, it's www.dysgraphia.life. And we have a section for the Dysgraphia webinar series, so you can go back and watch past webinars. There's also a lot of educational information there and articles. I also encourage those of you who may be professionals who are joining us tonight to look at the professionals database. That's an area where you can have a listing to sign up as a teacher or tutor or language therapist, and then members of our community can find you and utilize our services. So it's a way for us to connect people with specialists who have expertise in dysgraphia. So please check that out. Tonight, we are going back to dysgraphia research, which is an area that I am very excited about. We have with us tonight Drs. Rapp and McCloskey from Johns Hopkins University. I was just telling them that their paper on developmental dysgraphia, which was a overview of developmental dysgraphia as well as a framework for future research, was one of the first that I found when I started looking through the scientific literature to really try to understand developmental dysgraphia and what was going on. I found a lot of things that were focused on handwriting, but this was one of the first pieces that really spoke to what I was experiencing as a parent, which was way more than handwriting, problems with spelling, problems with composition, and really the entire package of written expression. So I am really excited to let them talk to you about their research and their understanding of developmental dysgraphia tonight. Dr. Rapp earned her undergraduate degree in elementary and special education and worked as a learning disabilities teacher before going back and getting her PhD in psychology at Johns Hopkins. And Dr. McCloskey is a professor of cognitive science at Johns Hopkins who also received his PhD there in cognitive psychology. So we are really excited to have both of them. They are going to do it in two parts and hand off to each other in the middle. And with that, I will let Dr. McCloskey take it away.
Thank you, Jennifer. We really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all. So the way we're going to work it is that I'm going to start out, and then I'm going to hand the baton to Brenda about halfway through. And I'm going to dive right in so that we keep on schedule. So let me start first by talking about what we mean when we say dysgraphia. And so we use this term to mean substantial difficulty with any aspect of writing, including spelling, written composition, the ability to string together coherent sentences and paragraphs, and also handwriting, which Jennifer has already mentioned. And here we're talking not about slightly messy handwriting, but we're talking about handwriting that is very slow and effortful and may border on illegible. And we call this dysgraphia when we see these difficulties despite at least average intellectual ability in a child, and also, of course, adequate educational opportunity. And finally, adequate motor skills for handwriting. So this would not be difficulties, due to not having the fine motor control you need to write. And the type of dysgraphia we'll be talking about is that's usually evident when children are learning to write in school, and then it can continue into adulthood. Let me next say a couple of words about our perspective. We are cognitive scientists and researchers, and our focus is on the knowledge and the mental processes that are required for writing, the knowledge and processes that underlie our writing abilities. And I'll say more about what I mean by that in a moment. And so from that perspective, when we're looking at a child with dysgraphia, we feel that it's important to ask several questions. One is, what knowledge or mental processes have not been adequately learned? Of the various things you need to be able to do in order to write, where is the problem coming up? And second, why is this problem come up? What are the reasons for the difficulty in learning? If this child has not been able to learn some aspect of the knowledge that's critical for writing, what's caused this difficulty? And in our view, answers to these questions are critical for guiding efforts to help children with dysgraphia. We need to know, what you have to be able to do in order to write effectively, and what is not working for any particular child in order to be able to to target efforts at help. And finally, I want to say that dysgraphia occurs in many forms. Writing is a complex set of processes, and a difficulty with any of them will cause some kind of dysgraphia. So these different forms reflect difficulty with different aspects of the critical knowledge and processing skills. And so there is no one set of one-size-fits-all answers for anything we'll be talking about here. Let me set the stage for the rest of the discussion by giving you 3 brief examples from children that we've worked with in our research. So the first of these is PJ, who was an 8-year-old boy who completed 2nd grade when we were working with him. PJ is extremely intelligent. He scored at the 99th percentile on measures of intellectual ability. His spoken language is absolutely excellent, and he is also a very good reader, reads far above grade level. So this 8-year-old boy, while we were working with him, was reading this biography of the Wright brothers that was written for adults. But if we look at PJ's writing, it didn't look like what you might expect for a child of his general ability. And I'm just going to show you one example from a homework assignment here. So the assignment said, name one dangerous liquid and one dangerous solid, and he's written something there. And then the second part is explain why it's important to keep dangerous solids and liquids in their original containers. And you can just see, looking at this, that his handwriting is kind of difficult to read. And also PJ finds it very, very unpleasant to write. Now, if we get past the handwriting issues by transcribing what he's written, we can see that's not the only issue. And if you look here, you can see that even when you have all the letters, it's not completely apparent what he's trying to say. And in fact, only, I think, 2 of the words in this example are spelled correctly. But if we decode what PJ was trying to say, we find he really has given a very good answer. So for the dangerous liquid, he says bleach, and for a dangerous solid, he says nuclear waste. And then why they should be kept in their original containers, he says, because if it looked like something else, then someone might drink or eat it. And you can see here, I would think that it's going to be very difficult for PJ's teachers to know what he knows from this kind of written work. So here's an example where PJ is having difficulty with both spelling and handwriting. Now, my second example is a 10-year-old boy that we are currently working with, and we asked him, SRL, to just write a description of what was happening in this rather outdated picture. And this is what he wrote. I don't expect you to be able to read that. You can just see the handwriting is not particularly good. I transcribed this, and again, don't worry too much about the details, but there's a lot of spelling errors in here, even for words like doesn't or sink or so forth. Then if I correct for those errors, we still have issues because this is just all one run-on sentence that really doesn't come together. So he says, the mom has bad spatial awareness and her kid inherited. These are great ideas, right? But the mom can't tell that the sink is overflowing and the kids don't see the mom as she does, and they could not predict what not see the kids was going to happen. The sister doesn't not see the both falling. Well, so here we have an example where there's difficulty with spelling and handwriting and written composition. Right. And finally, just to contrast with that, here is another 10-year-old, a girl this time, AKR. And I'm going to show you one example of her work. This is something she wrote on her own to complain about a dinner she was served at home. And her handwriting is not beautiful, but it's perfectly readable. You probably have trouble reading it here, so I'm transcribing it. And one thing to notice here is there are a lot of spelling errors. Restaurant, unknown, colorful, words, chocolate, bananas, and so forth and so on. But if we work past the spelling, we see it just I think, a delightful composition. She says, the local restaurant with an unknown name got a very bad review today. While trying to accommodate a customer's allergies, the customer was given a very bland plate. It was not colorful and delightful. In the customer's words, it was more like a large snack plate than a dinner. The chocolate-covered bananas at the end hardly made up for it. Plus, the customer was taunted by the smells of a spinoff of one of her favorite dishes, which she cannot eat due to allergies. Okay, so AKR does have trouble with spelling, clearly. Her handwriting is perfectly adequate, and I would say that when it comes to composition, she is an excellent writer. Now, these are all very bright kids. They have good language and reading abilities aside from the writing here, but yet they have different patterns of difficulty. All right, so some points we can take from these examples are first that dysgraphia may involve difficulty with any combination of spelling, handwriting, and composition, any one, two, or all three of those. Dysgraphia certainly occurs in children with average or above average intelligence, spoken language, and reading ability. It definitely does not imply lack of intelligence, and it can occur even when reading is just fine. Now, on the other hand, dysgraphia may be accompanied by other cognitive difficulties, such as some problems with spoken language, and especially reading difficulties with dyslexia. It does often co-occur with dyslexia, but it need not. And there may be also some other difficulties like attention deficit disorder that may go along with it. Now, parents of children who are struggling with dysgraphia often face some obstacles in getting help. Partly because dysgraphia is not widely recognized or understood. Everybody's heard of dyslexia, whether they're just the person on the street or teachers and school administrators, but dysgraphia, not so much. Second, difficulties with writing are often viewed just as an aspect of dyslexia. And so if the child is also struggling with reading, the writing problem tends to get pushed in the background as just sort of one perhaps not too important symptom. But on the other hand, if the child does not have difficulty with reading, then the situation is confusing because the dysgraphia is supposed to be part of a reading problem. And just more generally, writing is not always considered terribly important, so dysgraphia may not be considered a significant problem. But I think you could see, just say, taking that example of PJ's bleach and nuclear waste answer, that he faces difficulties in any of his schoolwork that requires any written production. All right, I now want to shift gears a little bit because in the remainder of this presentation, we're going to focus on one aspect of dysgraphia, and that is difficulties with spelling. And what we're going to do is I'm first going to talk about the knowledge and processes required for spelling. This will sort of explain what I meant a little while ago when I talked about knowledge and mental processes. And then with that as a background, that gives us a way of thinking about types of spelling difficulty that may arise. Then I'm going to turn it over to Brenda, who is going to talk about diagnosing spelling difficulties, causes of difficulty in learning to spell. Why do some children have difficulty learning to spell? And finally, say a few words about helping a child with dysgraphia. And I want to warn you right now that we're going to have less to say about that last topic than any of us might wish. All right, so let's talk about knowledge and processes in spelling. So suppose you're writing something and you need to write the word green. So you probably have in mind the idea of green in some way, and maybe the sound of the word green as well. And let me just say a word about this funny stuff here about the sound of the word. Linguists use symbols, usually letters, not always, to indicate the component sounds in a word. So they use the G to indicate the G sound, the R to indicate the sound, and so forth. This I colon is to indicate the long sound E, okay? And they just put everything between slashes just to remind us that they're talking about the sounds of the word and not a written spelling. But anyway, if you're thinking about green and the sound of the word green, that's all very well and good, but it doesn't tell you how to write green. In order to do that, you need to know how the word is spelled. And fortunately, most of us, pretty much everybody, probably has learned how some words are spelled so that you have memorized the spellings of words. If you are a typical speller, you've learned the spellings of many, many, many words. And so this knowledge of how words are spelled, I'm going to call whole word spelling knowledge. So somewhere in this set of memories of spellings, you have the information that the word cat is spelled C-A-T. And you also have that green is spelled G-R-E-E-N. And so if you're thinking about the idea of green and maybe the sound of the word green, that will help you to activate that memory of the spelling and then in turn to write the word with the correct spelling. But there's also another way that you can come up with at least a potential spelling for a word using, in this case, the sound of the word. And we call that sound to spelling conversion. And this relies not on knowledge of a spelling of a whole word, but rather knowledge about the correspondences between sounds and letters or letter groups. So when you've learned phonics in school or just through your experience with spoken and written language, you've learned things like that the G sound is usually written with a G, the sound with an R, the sound with an N, and so forth. So that if this spelling sound to spelling conversion process, we're trying to work out a spelling for the word green, it will be pretty straightforward to pick G as the first letter, followed by R with an N at the end. The complications come in with that E sound because that sound can be spelled in lots of different ways in English words. It can be EE, but it can also be EA, IE, and so forth, a lot of other things. So the conversion process has to choose one of those options, and it doesn't know the correct answer. It's just using this sound spelling knowledge. And so it might choose EE, in which case, by luck, the spelling is correct, but it might just as well choose EA, in which case the spelling that you arrived at will be GREAN. This is a perfectly reasonable spelling. It sounds right. It's a phonetic spelling. It just doesn't happen to be the correct one. And good spelling, in fact, requires both of these. So you need whole word spelling knowledge, memorized whole word spellings, to ensure that you get the correct spellings for words. But you also need the sound to spelling conversion to produce plausible spellings, these phonetic spellings for unfamiliar words. If you need to jot down an unfamiliar name, or you just have to write a word that you haven't learned the spelling of. This sound spelling conversion knowledge also probably contributes to memorizing the spellings of whole words. Okay, now with this way of thinking about spelling knowledge and processes, we can begin to get a handle on what might not develop properly, and so where spelling difficulties might come up. And so we can think straightforwardly of two types of spelling difficulties. One would be inadequate learning of the whole word spellings, not memorizing the spellings normally. And the second would then be inadequate learning of the sound to spelling conversion process. So I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to go over what we would expect from both of those types of difficulty. And by the way, I should add that, of course, there could be difficulty with both of these. And we see all of those sorts of things in our work. Okay, so what do we expect of someone who's having difficulty learning the whole word spellings? Well, what this would mean is not that they can't learn any of them, but they just have learned fewer than would be expected for their age or grade level. So someone who is struggling with memorizing spellings may very well have learned the spelling for cat, but may not have learned the spelling for green. And so if they're trying to write the word green, they can't just look up the spelling and use that to produce the word. When you don't know the spelling of the word, what you have to do is rely on the sound to spelling conversion process. So in someone who doesn't know as many whole word spellings as expected, they're going to be using this process more often than someone who is a better speller. And so they may come up with spellings like Grean. Their spellings look very reasonable. They just don't happen to be the correct spellings. But more specifically, we expect in children like this to see good spelling for what we call regular words. These are words like plant, where the spelling of the word is very predictable from the way the word sounds. There's really only one reasonable way to spell it. And so for those words, even if you haven't learned the spelling, the sound spelling conversion will usually come up with the correct spelling. And in this case, say spelling plant, P-L-A-N-T. In contrast, you will see poor spelling for irregular words, those where you can't fully predict the spelling just from the sound. I mean, green is an example. Most of it is predictable, but the E sound, you don't know exactly how that should be spelled. And there are many words that it's even more difficult. There are more possibilities. And so for those words, sound spelling conversion, again, will generate spellings that are plausible, but sometimes incorrect. Okay. Like spelling giant, J-I-E-N-T, as one of the children we worked with did. All right, so that's if there's weakness in the whole word spelling knowledge. What about the sound spelling conversion process? There could be incomplete or incorrect knowledge of sound spelling correspondences. This is kind of difficulty learning the phonics. Let me give you just one example here. Think about words like germ or bird. They both have an sound in them. And linguists use this odd looking symbol for that sound, but that's not too important. In English words, that sound can be spelled lots of different ways. But what we sometimes see in children is that they actually learn a correspondence, a rule that is not right. They learn a correspondence that cannot be used. And that is just to spell that sound with a single R. And so if you have an incorrect rule like this and you're needing to use sound spelling conversion to spell a word, you will make errors like bird being spelled B-R-D and work as W-R-K, both again examples from our research. Notice this is a different kind of error than spelling green, G-R-E-A-N. When you do that, the sound spelling conversion is working just fine. It just doesn't have any way of knowing what's the correct spelling. Here you're using an incorrect rule and producing something that is not a possible spelling for the word. So these are not possible words in English. You have to have a vowel there. All right, so I've talked to you about then the types of knowledge and processes of spelling and the kinds of difficulties you could get with a problem with either one. And that's going to bring me to the end of my part of the presentation. And so I'm now going to turn it over to Brenda, who is going to pick up with the topic of diagnosing spelling difficulties. And thank you, and I'll be around for questions at the end. All right, over to you, Brenda.
Okay, so let me share my screen. And let's see. First, let me make sure that is that visible?
Yes.
Okay, fabulous. Well, hello, everybody. I'm really delighted to be here. And let me pick up where Mike left off. So what Mike did was provide really a framework for understanding the cognitive processes of spelling. And that kind of understanding can help us in diagnosing the particular spelling difficulties that an individual might have. And in order to figure out which of these processes are affected, what's very useful is to consider both accuracy levels and error types. These are going to be the clues that we have for helping us figure out whether whole word knowledge is affected, is not developed normally, or sound to spelling conversion processes haven't. Okay, so I'm going to walk through that. So first of all, in terms of accuracy, so let's think for a moment about sound to spelling conversion. So if this process hasn't developed fully, then what do we expect to see in terms of accuracy? Well, remember, this is a system that allows us to use our knowledge of how sounds and letters map onto each other. So that's that knowledge. So if it hasn't developed fully, then what we expect to see is low accuracy or difficulties in situations where you need that spelling, that sound to spelling knowledge. And so where do you most need that sound to spelling knowledge? You need it in situations where you don't have, you know, the memory of how a word is spelled. So you need it most often in spelling of new words you haven't spelled before. So new words are what we sometimes call made up words when we're trying to figure out whether this process is you know, not fully developed. And so we expect to see low accuracy for made up words. Mike gave some examples here, some others. If you know, you ask someone to spell flope or daff or zern, these aren't real words. And so the only system that you can use to spell these is your sound to spelling conversion, your knowledge of how sounds and letters map onto each other. So if somebody does not have a well-developed sound to spelling conversion system, they will have low accuracy with new or made up words. Okay, so what about if there's difficulty with whole word spelling knowledge? What do we expect there in terms of accuracy? Well, remember, this is the system that stores the spellings of whole words, right? So that's the system that's storing the spelling of whole words. And so then we can think about, well, what do we especially need that system for? When do we most need it? Because that's when we'll see the lowest accuracy. That'll be the diagnostic for understanding whether that system hasn't fully developed. And so we mostly need this system. It's most needed for spelling words whose spellings are not predictable, right? So these are words where you can't predict their spelling. You can't just apply your sound to spelling conversion knowledge. So what we expect to see if the system isn't fully developed is we expect to see low accuracy with words that don't have these predictable spellings, or what we sometimes call irregular words. And you might have heard that term before. So irregular words are going to be the words that should have low accuracy compared to words that have predictable spellings like regular words. So irregular words, some examples are like come, laugh, heart, was, have, said. These are very common words. So it's not that they're uncommon words. It's just that you wouldn't be able to predict their spelling if you hadn't seen their spellings before. And that's what makes them irregular. If you just knew how to map sounds onto spellings very well, if your sound to spelling conversion system was intact, you could spell regular words, but you'd have difficulty in accurately spelling or consistently spelling these irregular words. So these are, in terms of accuracy, we would make these predictions. We would expect to see these kinds of difficulties associated with difficulties in sound to spelling conversion, and another set of difficulties associated with difficulties with whole word spelling knowledge. So accuracy on these different kinds of words is a clue, or clues to which system is affected. What about error types? So let's think about the sound to spelling conversion system. So if it's not fully developed, we know that it will be difficult to spell unfamiliar words that haven't been learned before. And what kind of errors should we see in those words? Well, we should see what we call implausible spellings, right? Because the sound to spelling system is what allows us to do plausible or phonetic spellings for things that we don't know. And if that system isn't fully developed, then we'll see implausible spellings for new words or made up words. For example, if someone is asked to spell the made up word zern, there are various ways, as Mike said, that would be plausible for spelling this. And so there's more than one plausible answer. But if you spelled it in this way, this would not be a plausible spelling, right? This would be an implausible spelling of zern. So this would be an implausible spelling for a made up word. Or if you were asked to spell quoik, you might think of a couple of different ways of spelling it, but this would not be one of the ways that you would spell it. And so these are errors that we see that come about when the sound to spelling conversion system isn't working fully, not fully developed. So those are the kinds of errors, these implausible errors that we would expect when sound to spelling conversion isn't fully developed, and when it's being asked to spell, when it's being asked to produce responses. What kinds of errors would we expect if the whole word spelling knowledge system isn't fully developed? Again, you know, we need to remember that this is the system that stores the spellings of whole words, so that regardless of whether the words are plausible or not, you know, those spellings are stored and we can go into the system and find them. So if this system isn't fully developed, then we expect performance to be, as we said, with accuracy to be to be lower with irregular words, but what kinds of errors should we expect to see? And the kinds of errors we should expect to see, if this system isn't working, but the sound to spelling conversion system is working, then when people are asked to spell irregular words, we should see them using their sound to spelling conversion system, and they should be producing plausible, perfectly reasonable spellings, but they're just not the correct spellings for irregular words. So we might see a word like train spelled T-R-A-N-E. That's a perfectly plausible spelling. It's just not the whole word spelling that would be stored in this whole word spelling knowledge system. This spelling is generated by somebody who has difficulty with whole word spellings, but is able to use their sound to spelling conversion. Or, for example, result. This is another phonologically plausible error for an irregular word. So these are, so you can see how the different kinds of errors on different kinds of words are the clues that we use to discover which of the spelling components are affected. And this is just a summary slide, just to put that all together, the kinds of the signs that we can see in terms of accuracy and error patterns if there's difficulties in the sound to spelling conversion system, low accuracy in spelling new words and non-phonetic spellings. If there's difficulty with whole word spelling knowledge, then we would see low accuracy for irregular or words that don't have predictable spellings compared to words that are regular or have predictable spellings. And we would expect to see phonetic spellings for these irregular words. These are all the examples that I walked through with you. And it's important also to note, as Mike mentioned, that of course there could be difficulties in both of these systems, and then the error patterns are more complex, and they're a mixture of these. But these are the clues that we use to identify which of these spelling processes may not have developed fully. Just to help you, just to give you an example to kind of, apply your knowledge. This is a AKR. She's a 5th grader that we worked with. And so I just presenting a little bit of data from AKR about her reading, just that was very good. And here is a little bit of data about her spelling. And so I just want you to take a couple of seconds to think about which of these spelling processes do you think are affected in AKR's case. So let me give you a minute to think about that. Okay, you can see her accuracy here with made up words, her accuracy with irregular words, and some of her responses with irregular words. Okay, so hopefully some of you, guessed that it was our whole word spelling knowledge that's not well developed. I mean, I don't know if you put that in chat or not. I'm not monitoring the chat, so I don't know, but let me just walk through it. So for her accuracy with made up words is 46th percentile, and that would put her just at average for her grade. And just to be clear about what percentiles are, they're different than percent correct. So percent correct is how many you got right out of a given list, but percentile is how your performance compares to a group that you're being compared to. So in this case, it would be how AKR's performance compares to children in the 5th grade. And what 46th percentile means is that her performance with new or made up words and spelling of new or made up words was as good as or better than 46% of children of her grade. So that puts her right in the middle. She's right in the middle of her grade level for made up words. But for irregular words, you can see that she's at the 14th percentile, which is low. And so that already is an indication that sound to spelling conversion seems to be in good shape because she's, at her grade level with made up words, and that there seems to be a problem with the whole word spelling knowledge, which is what she needs for spelling irregular words. And when we look at her errors, we see a confirmation of that, because we can see that her errors are perfectly reasonable errors. They're plausible errors, but they're incorrect for irregular words. These are not the correct spellings. And in order to have the correct spellings for these irregular words, she would have needed to go into her whole word spelling knowledge, which doesn't seem to have been as developed up to her grade level. Okay, so hopefully that example allowed you to see sort of an application of putting these things together in a particular case. And so we would conclude that there seems to be difficulties with whole word spelling knowledge in her case. Okay, so just to summarize this diagnosing of spelling difficulties, it's just what I said. Sort of the take-home points are, in order to determine this, what is useful is to assess spelling with different types of words. We saw made-up words, regular words, irregular words. These kinds of words are useful in diagnosing where the spelling difficulties are coming from. Right, these are the kinds of words that I just mentioned. And that in addition to looking at accuracy on different kinds of words, we can also look at error types. And this combination of information is what provides a window into understanding which processes are affected. Okay, so we've talked about the key components of the spelling system, and we've tried to identify which of them may or may not have developed to normal levels. And this naturally raises the question of why didn't they develop normally? You know, we've ruled out obvious reasons like lack of education or serious perceptual or emotional difficulties. And so this leads us to ask, well, what are the kinds of skills that are needed for normal development of these spelling components? And you know, what kinds of skills are needed to build the spelling system? And in that regard, many different kinds of skills actually have been proposed, and many are needed. So among the ones that have been proposed are spoken vocabulary, phonological awareness, visual and phonological working memory, visual and phonological long-term memory, visual motor integration, and many others. The point is that that learning to spell, building a spelling system requires the integration and the coordination of a number of different processes. These are the skills that are needed to build the system. And so why are we talking about these things? You know, we've talked about spelling, its components. Why do we need to think about these, what are potentially underlying difficulties? And it's important because if weakness in these underlying skills is what has contributed to these spelling difficulties, then understanding these underlying weaknesses may help guide us in our interventions. It may be helpful to target some of these underlying skills in trying to strengthen the systems that haven't fully developed. Now, the challenge for us in this is that, you know, the fact of the matter is we don't really know with certainty which skills are critical for learning to spell. So we have many candidate skills that seem to be involved in learning to spell, but there's still quite a bit of research that's needed to really identify with, you know, more certainty which skills are critical for learning to spell. But what I'll do here is just touch on a few of those, just really briefly, to give you a sense of what kinds of skills we're talking about and sort of give you a little bit more information about these. So spoken vocabulary. So certainly spoken vocabulary can play an important role in developing the spelling system. It serves as a foundation, a kind of scaffolding for learning new whole word spellings, because they build on learning the spellings of new words, you know, and storing them builds on the spoken word vocabulary that you already have and helps expand that sound to spelling conversion system. And so it's certainly important to evaluate spoken vocabulary to understand if this could be an underlying difficulty in any given individual. One thing that we note, though, is that many children with dysgraphia, many of the cases that we've described here, may have normal to superior spoken vocabulary knowledge. So while this may be a source of difficulty in developing these systems, it's not necessarily a source of difficulty. What about phonological awareness? Many of you may have heard about phonological awareness as an underlying skill that contributes to developing spelling and reading. So what is it? Briefly, it's this awareness of the units of speech. It's this understanding that words are made up of individual sounds. So for example, and that these sounds then can map onto individual letters. So for example, it seems maybe obvious that the word cat, you know, is made up of 3 sounds, that the first sound in cat is a k, the last sound in cat is a t, or the word cash starts like cat. It has the same k sound at the beginning, but it has a different sound at the end, a sh. These things may seem extremely obvious to us. But this phonological awareness does not develop automatically, and there can be difficulties in developing this kind of awareness. And you can imagine that if there is this kind of difficulty, then learning how to map on sounds to letters, you know, may be really difficult. And then storing words in a way that is consistent with there being sounds and letters that map onto each other can also be difficult. So this certainly can be a source of difficulty in developing the spelling system, and it's very important to evaluate this. But again, I just want to note that it's not necessarily deficient. So it's not the case that children with spelling difficulties necessarily have difficulties in phonological awareness. And a couple of the children that Mike described to you, in fact, were perfectly normal in their assessments. There's of their phonological awareness. The CTOP is a test that's often given for this. What about working memory? Okay, so working memory systems are these cognitive systems that are used to maintain information in mind for a short period of time, from seconds to minutes. It's kind of a mental workspace where you put information while you're working on it. In spelling, working memory systems may be used to hold on to letters and sounds as you're trying to learn the mappings between them, or to hold on to letters while you're trying to write the letters. You need to keep the letters in mind so that you can, write the letters that are coming up. Or even when you're composing sentences, you need to keep in mind the words that you want to write while you're writing them. So these are the working memory systems that are used in spelling and writing. And one thing that's interesting is that research has shown that we have specialized working memory systems, different working memory systems for different kinds of materials. So there's visual working memory, or spatial working memory, or working memory for spoken sounds and letter strings. So these are separate systems, and they may develop, some may develop normally and some may not develop normally. And so some work in my lab just to illustrate the sort of independence between these different systems is some brain imaging work that we've done, where we can see this is an image of the brain, and what it's showing you here in pink is an area of the brain that's involved in working memory for speech sounds, and green working memory for spelling, for letters used in spelling. And you can see that these are nearby, but they're different areas of the brain. So these are different systems that can develop and need to be evaluated to see whether or not they might be contributing to developing these spelling components. And then briefly, I just want to talk about learning. So, I mean, spelling is about learning the sound of spelling mappings, learning the whole words, and not just learning them, but retaining them. That's this key part of learning. And so one question that one can have is whether or not learning and retention is a problem for any given child. And so these are systems that learn and store information for days, weeks, and years, which is what we need to have a fully developed spelling system, right? We need to learn and store the sound of spelling mappings, the whole word forms. And so assessing whether or not learning and retention are progressing normally is important. And here again is an area where research has shown us that these systems also are specialized for different types of information. So they're learning and memory or learning and retention systems that are different for visual information, or for faces, or for objects and spoken and written words. These are separate systems that develop separately and need to be evaluated separately. And so it's not, one of the things that we've been interested in our research is to see whether or not if a child is having difficulty learning and remembering spoken forms, do they necessarily have difficulty with written forms, and vice versa? To what extent are these things independent? Research suggests that they are independent. And so we've looked in some of our dysgraphic children that we're working with to see to what extent these may or may not be independent from one another. And so we've done that by evaluating how these children learn and remember new spoken words and written words. So we give them, we give them some unusual objects. We make up names for them. They have a spoken name. So the spoken name is annealant, for example, and we give it a spelling, and we teach them the spoken names and the written names of these words. And we see how their learning progresses and how they're able to retain the spoken words and the written words. And we also test children in this task, children who aren't having difficulties in dysgraphia, just to be able to compare them. And what we find is that in some children, at least, spoken word learning might be within normal range, while written word learning might not be. Okay, so let me just show you an example of that. This is SRL. So what you have in this graph is you have the percent correct, and then you have over a number of different sessions, and SRL's performance is the orange line, and the gray area is the range of what would be in normal performance. If you're outside that range, then you're falling outside of sort of the normal learner. And you can see for his spoken words that he's just fine. He's totally, perfectly well within the normal range. But when we look at his written word learning, you can see that he starts out below the normal range, and he stays there for a very long time. We went out with many sessions with him, and eventually he does learn the words, which is, encouraging and important to know. But you can see that the learning trajectory is much slower for him for written words than for other children, and the difference between spoken words and written words. So this just emphasizes that these systems can be independent from one another. So just to summarize what I said about underlying causes, the possible reasons, and there's more of them that we could examine. I've just looked at some of them and gone over them pretty quickly. But just to summarize the key points here, learning to spell requires coordinating a great number of different underlying skills. Unfortunately, there's still much that we don't understand about which of these skills are critically important and which are not. One thing that we do know, and that's we should not assume for individuals, is that they all have the same underlying difficulties. So while there's still much to be learned about these underlying difficulties, we can see that different individuals have difficulties with different underlying skills. We can't assume that there's only one underlying skill that's problematic in all individuals that have difficulty in learning how to spell. So that brings us to just the last slide here. And this is the topic that is possibly of most interest to all of you, and the one that we're, going to say the least about today. And although we've focused on, unfortunately, I wish we had more we had to say. Unfortunately, I wish there was more that we could tell you about this, but there are a few points that I want to make. And the points apply not only to spelling, but to writing difficulties in general. I just want to make a few key points here. The first is that it's incredibly important, as you probably know, to help a child understand that they are not stupid or lazy because they have difficulty with writing. We've spoken with children, of course, with adolescents, with young adults, and we've spoken with adults in their 60s and 70s and who had spelling difficulties. And even that many decades later, they still remember. It's still painful for them to think about their years in school when they were, having these difficulties, and they felt that they were stupid, and their teachers sometimes accused them of being lazy. So it's incredibly important to help children understand that this is not the case. Relatedly, it's important to advocate for the child and explain to others in school and other settings that they aren't stupid or lazy. This is a kind of a learning disability. It's a specific kind of learning disability, and advocating for them in this way and in others, of course, is incredibly important. As we've highlighted in our presentations, identifying the specific aspects of writing that are affected in any given individual is really critical for focusing remediation. We want to understand which areas of spelling they're having difficulty with, so that we can focus the remediation efforts. We don't want to waste our time working on aspects of spelling that are not really the problem. We want to try to identify what are the problems, what are they due to, and then try to focus remediation on those problems. And so that's really important. And then the last thing I wanted to say, just in terms of sort of thinking about remediation, is that there's sort of two broad approaches in remediation. One is to strengthen the affected processes, so identify where the weaknesses are and work on strengthening those weaknesses, and that is important. These are not these are not in exclusion of one another. So these are just two approaches in remediation that are important and useful. So strengthening the affected processes, and then the complement is to use the strengths to develop workarounds. So work on the weaknesses and then identify the strength and use those strengths to develop ways to work around the problem, to manage the spelling problem, and to gain success in spelling. Both of these approaches are a key part of a remediation program. And I think that remediation is something that all of us would like to spend much more time on and many more webinars on. So we can look forward to that in the future. And for now, I'd just like to thank you all for being here and thanking you for your interest in dysgraphia and your support for your children, for the adults, and for work in this area. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much to both of you. We have an extremely activated crowd tonight, and lots of questions and chatter going on. Dr. McCloskey, I think you attempted to address one of them, but it's come up quite a few times, so let me ask it so everyone can hear too, which is there was some confusion between dysgraphia and dyslexia and the spelling component in particular. How do you think about the two different disorders from a cognitive science perspective, and where are there potentially overlaps, or what is different?
Sure. I think the question that I saw in the chat in a couple of different ways, especially when we're talking about sound spelling conversion, is that kind of, isn't this just like an aspect of dyslexia? And there are a couple of things to say about that. One is that, just to emphasize again, that many children who suffer from writing difficulties also have difficulty with reading, and they can have similar difficulties, but that's not always the case. You can have perfectly good reading ability, not just good sight vocabulary, but also good phonics ability, the ability to sound out words and so forth. And your writing, your spelling can still suffer from difficulty with the sound spelling conversion. One thing to bear in mind here is that although both reading and spelling involve relating sounds and spellings, it's in a different direction. In reading, you're starting with the written form and generating the spoken form if you're talking about sounding a word out using phonics. So you need to know how spellings translate into sounds. In writing, it's the other way around. You may start with the sound and go to the spelling. And that's somewhat different knowledge. It's clearly very closely related, but it's not exactly the same thing. And those can separate from one another. So I do want to caution people not to just assume that something we're talking about is just like something going on in dyslexia. Okay.
That makes sense. And then a lot of questions about to the final point being made, what can we do about this? Do you have any recommendations for types of curriculum or, you know, ways to teach phonics or anything like that that you generally make? And it's okay to say no. I put in the chat, we generally recommend, you know, some of the same Orton Gillingham structured literacy based approaches to phonics that are used for dyslexia, but don't single out specific curricula. But I wanted to pose the question to all of you that could be, because we saw it a number of times, how do you teach spelling and where would you start?
Well, I'll just start with that, and I'm sure Mike will want to chime in. So, you know, it is, you know, just it's the case that we don't have good, you know, really good answers to that question, you know. So that's just to start off with. But that doesn't mean that they're, you know, that we're like totally in the dark. And so it is, as I said, as we've said, important to really identify what the problems are, because you want to focus whatever it is that you're doing on the problem the child is having and not on something else. And you can't assume that because, you know, often children might have difficulty with sound of spelling or whole words that your child, you know, will necessarily have that. So it is important to identify what it is that is difficult, and so that you can focus those efforts. And then, I mean, I think that, you know, very generally speaking, if you're going to work on sound to spelling conversion, I think that the phonics approaches, the general phonics approaches are useful. Remember that, though, as Mike said, that you're working on spelling and not on reading, right? So, you know, most of these approaches do focus on reading, where you're, you know, where children are, you know, being given letters and they need to figure out how they sound, right? Which is different than, and so as Mike said, many of the children we work with can do that. They can read well, right? They can look at letters and they know how they sound, right? So it's the reverse process that can be difficult. So it's the, you know, what do you do when you have the sound of a word in mind, like you're thinking the word table, you have that sound in mind, and you need to find the letters that can be used to spell it. So it's important that if you're using phonics approaches that are there, that you're trying to use them for spelling and not for reading. You're trying to really work on the process that goes from sounds to letters, okay? And so that's just one sort of pointer, you know, when you're using phonics approaches, which in general are a sort of a generally good approach. Again, you need to see for your particular child what they're specifically having difficulties. It may not just be all of phonics, right? There may be some particular aspects of this mapping of sounds to letters that might be difficult for one child and not for another. And we didn't go into like sort of those kind of detailed differences, but that's what you'd want to know, and keep in mind that it's sound to spelling. And also in terms of whole word practice. So again, in you know, I've worked a lot with dyslexia and reading. So when you're trying to develop a sight vocabulary, that's that sort of whole words, right? You're trying to, in reading, you're trying to develop when children see words, can they just recognize them really quickly, right? That's that sight vocabulary that a lot of people, you know, hear about. In spelling, remember, it's spelling. So it is that you want to be able to, you know, help your child learn how a word is spelled. But remember, they're not going to be seeing it. That's not the challenge for them. They're going to be having a word in mind that they want to remember what the spelling is for. So it's the opposite direction. So you have to train in the opposite direction. try to figure out a way to have them memorize the spellings, but so that they can use them when they're spelling, because it's not when they're reading that they need them, it's when they're spelling that they need them. So it's that reverse direction that is sometimes hard for people to wrap their head around in terms of focusing the remediation. I didn't know if you wanted to add something to that, Mike, something more specific.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I'm seeing a couple of questions in the chat about handwriting and an example of if there's a mechanical component where a person knows the spelling but mechanically produces a mistake when writing. Two quick comments here. First, one of the difficult things about handwriting difficulties is that they draw the child's attention away from other things that they should be focusing on, right? Or they would do better to focus on. So if you're so worried about how to write, you're struggling to produce anything written, you may or not be thinking as much about the spelling, much less, in general, what you're trying to say in a sentence or paragraph. And that just makes everything else harder. And that will be one reason, say, to try to work around that problem by having the student type or maybe even dictate. Yeah. But I guess another question, this gets to something more general, takes us off to the side a little bit. There are questions like, if a child has these symptoms, could they have dysgraphia? Like, because somebody who's an average speller but has poor handwriting, could they have dysgraphia? I'd like to suggest like getting away from just thinking like there's this like disease entity called dysgraphia and their symptoms, and you have to decide whether the symptoms mean that your child has that disease. Like, if you have certain symptoms, are you likely to have COVID or not? It's really not quite like that, right? So dysgraphia is just a label we apply to any of these manifestations, these symptoms, but they can have very different underlying causes. So yes, someone who is an average speller but really struggles with handwriting, we could apply the label dysgraphia to. That doesn't mean that child has difficulty with any of the same things that someone who is a really poor speller has. It means that there's something that's making it hard for them to go from their knowledge of the spelling to actually getting the motions out. So just if we could encourage you just to think in general, not just about this question, but about what remediation will work, is take the breath and ask, as Brenda was saying, what's really going wrong here? And that may not be enough to tell you how to fix it, but if you don't think about that, you're just going to go off picking, some program or something without having any real reason to do that. So you don't want to do a phonics program if your child's problem is with learning whole word spellings.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so I think there was a comment, just to emphasize that point, I think there was a comment, so should we do whole word learning instead of phonics? And the answer, that's not, there's no answer. I mean, there's no simple answer to that. It depends on the particular child and the kind of difficulty they're having. So a child that seems to be having primarily difficulty remembering whole word spellings, then it makes sense to try to help them memorize whole word spellings for spelling. If the difficulty seems to be in mapping letters and sounds, then phonics makes sense. And both are important. So it is also the case that you couldn't have a child that has difficulty with both of those things, right? They may have difficulty in knowing how to, generate a reasonable spelling for something they never heard before, and they might have difficulty in remembering words that they've tried to learn. So they can have difficulty in both, in which case it makes sense to work on both because both are needed for spelling. So in the end, in the adult system, there are these two sets of processes and we use both of them for spelling. So to be a, really competent speller, you do need both. But in terms of focusing your remediation efforts, there's not just a simple answer. It just depends on your child and what it is that they are having difficulty with.
I've also,
go ahead.
I was just going to real brief comment. I've seen a number of questions in the chat about like what kind of professional should I take my child to, right? An OT specialist or a neuropsychologist, or I wish that we could tell you there was someone you will go to who would really have the knowledge and experience. Those people are out there, but they're not. It's not like all OTs know how to deal with this sort of thing are all neuropsychologists or all speech language pathologists or so forth. So I would try to look for someone with experience with writing difficulties and, as much as possible, the same kind of difficulty that your child has. And I would look, one would hope to find someone with a willingness to talk to you about what we've been emphasizing, the processes that are the knowledge that are not quite up to par, rather than just going directly from a diagnostic label to we're going to treat it all with this. But to be perfectly honest with you, you are likely to have difficulty finding somebody with the necessary knowledge and experience.
Yeah, I see a number of questions also on like early signs, and are there sort of are there family, are there things to look for in young children, or is there a family links for dysgraphia? I think I don't know, maybe Mike has something to say about early signs. I think that's difficult. So just like, like an easy early sign, I think is a difficult thing to come up with. We do find family linkage. And so that doesn't mean that because a parent or a grandparent, had struggled in school with, spelling, that, anybody else is going to necessarily have that. But yes, we do tend to find that there's a family history. So there does seem to be. And sometimes that's actually, we found it can actually be helpful for someone to know that, that this is something, other things run in families too. Like, maybe you have relatives that are really good artists, or maybe you have relatives that are really good athletes. That these are sort of family traits. And, it could be the difficulty in spelling or not being a good singer. These are things that, you're not all alone. It isn't just something that happened to you. This is just, one of the things that, like your hair color and things that, come with your family. So sometimes that's helpful for children to understand that it can be that way.
And we see a lot of families who write in who say, I feel like I have this and now my child is having this. It's a very common, just anecdotal presentation that we see.
And it often goes in the other direction too. The parent or grandparents may realize that they've had this problem once the child is diagnosed. I wanted to add one thing about early signs, and that's more in the other direction, which is do not panic if your young child is producing very weird spellings for words, writing letters and numbers backwards and things like that. It's perfectly normal for very young children. Okay, so what you want to watch out for is if teachers start calling attention to the spelling or so forth, and of course teachers are not always kind of up to speed on everything. They may not notice everything. So this is not to say you shouldn't be aware of it on your own, but just don't assume that anything that doesn't look right in your child's writing means that they have dysgraphia.
Yeah, and one thing I've seen in the questions a couple of times that I believe you've done some research on, so I want to see if you would comment, is the use of technology versus making students actually write by hand. With it, it's a topic of high interest in our audience because particularly as kids transition to middle school and high school, a lot of times they can get their thoughts out by using the technology in a very productive way, but where is that line? Is there benefit to having them do the handwriting? What is your take on
that? Well, I take a little stab at it. I mean, there, in some of the research, certainly we've done in my group, shows that there's some advantages to writing in terms of learning letters and the spellings of words, that it can be a benefit to actually make the shapes, helps you recognize letters. So I think there are some early benefits for that in the normal situation. Writing, the words is a way of really understanding the letters and the letter shapes and understanding, how the letters come together and, memorizing them. So there are some benefits for that. But of course, those benefits are, can be offset by somebody who's having tremendous difficulty in writing, right? And so at some point, it's not a benefit anymore if you're, if you're struggling, if you're unhappy, if you're, not successful. So I think you need to see, when it's no longer a benefit. And I think with some of these kids, you'll see pretty early on that it's no longer a benefit for them. And this is where we, you need to use their strengths in order to help them succeed. So then moving over into keyboarding, we certainly, advise people to go into keyboarding as soon as, it's plausible, because, it is a way, exactly what people are saying. It's a way to have children express their thoughts and be successful, in expressing their thoughts. And it's so important. to be able to do that. And that, you know, certainly today, you know, with the technology we have, you're able to do that. And it's more important for, you know, for these kids to be able to learn how to express their thoughts. And if they've learned how to read, you know, any benefit you get from writing, you know, is not, you know, that might help you in learning the letter shapes and then, you know, benefit you in early reading. But once you've learned, you know, if you've learned how to read, you don't need to, you know, be writing the words anymore is my view. And also just as soon as it really becomes an obstacle, you need to find a way to work around it. What would you add anything to that, Mike?
No, I just to highlight that we have to take account of the emotional costs of these sorts of things. You know, a student who is crying, you know, for an hour over homework every night, and, you know, with an assignment that other kids might finish in 10 minutes, whatever benefit you might get from writing is just not worth it.
Absolutely.
And especially given the technology we have, you do not have, your handwriting does not have to be good. And if it's making you miserable, and if it's meaning you don't devote enough time to the things you really should be learning, then I would bypass it, you know, without a second thought.
Yeah, and I would advocate for, you know, that's an area that often requires advocacy in the classroom, in the school. You know, when a child is not able to express their thoughts, they need to be, you know, given whatever tools you can find for them, so that they can express their thinking, because they need to be able to develop. I mean, you need to be able to express yourself, but they also need to be able to develop that ability to compose, you know, coherent sentences and paragraphs, because they're going to, of course, need that, you know, even more as they move through the, you know, years in school and so on. So you don't want them to fall behind in composition, because, you know, they're not able to actually write, you know, write easily. Yeah.
That sounds great. I know we're over time. Thank you so much for your time tonight. We've gotten a lot of questions, so we'll see if we can answer any of them offline too. But many people asked where they can find this recording. We'll have it up in about a week on the Dysgraphia Life website under the Dysgraphia webinar series section. There were also a number of questions about executive functioning and composition. Our last webinar was all about writing in an executive function, so I encourage you to go back and watch that one. And there was one by Dr. Pfeiffer a little while ago that was on assessments too. So that's another one to look for based on some of the questions in the chat. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everything, but we really appreciate having Dr. Rapp and Dr. McCloskey on tonight. As I said, we have a huge research focus. We are really looking to start a research registry for Dysgraphia Life in the coming year, where we would be able to start to answer many of these questions about your own experiences, things like family histories, things like which ones of these different symptoms are affecting different people, to get more of a feel for what the community looks like in a really systematic, research-focused way. So stay tuned for that. Please visit the website. We do provide these free of charge, so we appreciate donations whenever there's a button on the website. And thank you, everybody, for attending. And thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting us, Jennifer. We really enjoyed doing this.
Thank you, Jennifer.
And we've got the chat
everybody
filled
here.
with thank yous now. So it was clearly highly appreciated by the community. So thank you very much, and have a great night, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.